He didn't even let her finish stepping off the train. Margaret Holloway shoved through the crowd on the platform, grabbed the man's sleeve, and hissed loud enough for 30 strangers to hear. "That is not what you ordered." Chester Pruitt, broad-shouldered, sunburned, the kind of man who thought every room belonged to him, turned and looked at the woman who had traveled 400 miles to become his wife. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they're returning to a store. Then he said it. Right there, in front of everyone. "I can't marry that." Eliza Rowan stood on the platform with her suitcase at her feet and her heart cracking open like dry soil. She didn't cry, not yet. She just stood there while the crowd parted around her like water around a stone. And she thought, this is where my life ends. She was wrong. If this story already has your heart pounding, subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because every single week we bring you stories that will make you laugh, cry, and question everything. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that platform, because what happened next changed 4 lives forever. The train had been running 6 hours late. Eliza Rowan knew this because she had counted every minute of it, sitting in the last car with her suitcase wedged between her knees and a letter folded so many times it had gone soft at the creases. She had read that letter more times than she could honestly admit. Not because she didn't have it memorized, she did, word for word, but because holding it made the whole impossible thing feel slightly more real. Dear Miss Rowan, I am a man of modest means and honest habits. I have 2 daughters, aged 6, who need the guidance of a woman with a steady hand and a warm spirit. I do not require beauty. I require character. If you possess the latter, I believe we may suit one another well. Yours respectfully, C. Pruitt. Character. She had thought about that word for 3 weeks before writing back. She was 29 years old, the daughter of a seamstress and a man who drank more than he worked, and she had never once in her life been called beautiful. Plain, mostly. Unremarkable. Once at a church social in Ohio, a boy had described her to his friend as the one with the serious face, and that had followed her like a shadow ever since. But character? That she had. That she had worked for carefully, the way you work for anything that doesn't come easy. So she wrote back. She packed her one good dress and her sewing kit and her mother's Bible, which she kept not for scripture but because her mother had pressed wildflowers between the pages, and some of them were still there, still faintly purple. And she got on a train headed west to Silver Hollow, Wyoming, where a man named Chester Pruitt was supposedly waiting to give her a life. She should have known something was wrong when nobody was at the first stop to meet her. She should have known something was worse when the station master at Silver Hollow looked at her ticket, looked at her face, and then looked away in the specific way that people look away when they already know something you don't. But she was tired from the journey, and her dress had a wrinkle down the front that wouldn't shake out. And she was busy trying to look like a woman who belonged somewhere, so she didn't notice any of it. She noticed Chester Pruitt, though. He was hard to miss. He was standing at the far end of the platform with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his hat pushed back on his head, and he was tall enough that she spotted him before she'd finished coming down the steps. For one stupid, embarrassing second, she thought, he's handsome. And then immediately after that, he's looking at me the way people look at mistakes. She walked toward him anyway because there was nothing else to do. The suitcase banged against her leg. Her shoes, which had seemed sensible in Ohio, felt suddenly too loud on the wooden planks. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "I'm Eliza Rowan." He said nothing for a moment, just looked at her face, her dress, her hair which had flattened under her traveling hat, her hands which were rough from years of sewing work. Then the woman appeared. Eliza hadn't seen her standing slightly behind him. Margaret Holloway, she'd learned the name later, his neighbor's wife, a woman with the kind of pointed prettiness that came from spending a great deal of time maintaining it. Margaret stepped forward and said, loud and carrying, "Chester, that is not what you described to us." Chester Pruitt cleared his throat. And then he said the thing, "I can't marry that." The platform wasn't crowded, but it was crowded enough. There was a family with 3 children waiting for a different train. There were 2 ranch hands loading feed sacks onto a wagon. There was a station master pretending to read something on his clipboard. There was a man she hadn't noticed yet standing near the far wall with 2 small girls pressed against his legs, and he went very still. Eliza stood there and heard every syllable land. She had prepared herself for a lot of things on this journey. She had prepared herself for the possibility that Chester Pruitt might be disappointed. She had even prepared herself, in the darkest part of her thoughts, for the possibility that he might change his mind. People change their minds. That was painful, but survivable. She had not prepared herself to be called that in front of strangers. "I see," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was proud of it, distantly, the way you're proud of something that has nothing to do with you. "You wrote that you didn't require beauty," she added. "You wrote that you required character." "I require a woman who doesn't embarrass me," Chester said, and his voice wasn't even cruel exactly. It was just flat, like he was discussing a fence post that wasn't the right length. "Margaret here could have told me from the description alone that this wouldn't work. I don't know what you expected coming all this way." "I expected," Eliza said quietly, "that a man who wrote those words meant them." She picked up her suitcase. She had no idea where she was going. She had $11 in her coat pocket, which was not enough to get back to Ohio, and she had no family left to go back to anyway, and the town of Silver Hollow, Wyoming spread out behind the station like it hadn't decided yet whether to be something or nothing. She didn't know a single person in it, but she turned around and she started walking because she was not going to stand there 1 second longer. "Miss?" The voice was quiet. Not loud enough to carry, not soft enough to miss. She stopped. She turned. The man from near the wall had taken 2 steps toward her. He was lean and weathered, the kind of weathered that comes from years of outdoor work rather than age, and his face was the sort of face that had probably never been described as handsome, but had something better than that, an expression of complete steadiness, like a man who had seen enough difficult things that one more difficult thing didn't rattle him. The 2 small girls were still attached to his legs, one on each side, peering at her from behind his knees with identical dark eyes. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. "My name is Silas Boone," he said. "I apologize for—" He glanced briefly toward Chester Pruitt in a way that communicated everything without saying anything. "I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. There wasn't anywhere else to stand." Eliza looked at him. She looked at the 2 small girls. "Are those your daughters?" she asked, because she needed to say something, and that was the first thing her brain produced. "Yes, ma'am. Hazel and Ruby. They're 6. He paused. "They've been without their mother for 2 years. She waited. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. Silas Boone cleared his throat once, the way a person does when they're about to say something they've thought carefully about saying. Then he said, "My girls need a mother." The platform was quiet enough that she heard the feed sacks thudding into the wagon bed. She heard one of the children, Hazel or Ruby, she didn't know which yet, shift her feet against the wood. She heard Chester Pruitt make a sound somewhere behind her, halfway between a scoff and a laugh. "You're serious," she said. "I'm always serious," Silas said. "I know that doesn't recommend me particularly well, but I am. I can't offer you much. I have a ranch up in the valley. It needs work. The cabin wants repairs. I'm away most mornings before light, and I come in after dark. It's not a comfortable life." He turned his hat one more time. "But I'd treat you decently, and my girls—" He stopped. Started again. "They need someone steady." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the 2 small girls who were looking back at her with the particular solemn attention of children who have learned to assess strangers quickly because strangers matter more than they used to. She looked at her suitcase. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't. I don't know this town. I don't know your ranch or your girls or anything about your life." "That's true. And you don't know me." Silas Boone looked at her steadily. "I know what I saw just now. I know how you handled yourself." He glanced once more toward Chester, not with anger, just a kind of dismissal, the way you dismiss something that isn't worth your sustained attention. "That tells me something." Behind her, Margaret Holloway said something to Chester in a low voice that Eliza chose not to hear. Chester laughed, short and unpleasant. Eliza turned back to Silas Boone. "I'm not beautiful," she said. "If that matters to you, you should say so now." Something moved across his face. Not pity. She would have recognized pity and walked away from it. Something more complicated than that. something that looked strangely like the memory of pain. "My wife was beautiful," he said quietly. "She left anyway." He cleared his throat again. "So, no, it doesn't particularly matter to me." The girl on his left leg, Hazel, though Eliza wouldn't learn which was which until much later, made a small sound and tugged on his sleeve. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. Something passed between them, some private currency of a parent and child, and then he looked back at Eliza. "You don't have to decide this moment," he said. "If you need to find lodging in town, I have $11, she said. "I don't think I can afford indecision." His mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "Fair enough." Eliza picked up her suitcase. She was 29 years old, and she had traveled 400 miles for a man who couldn't marry that. And she was standing on a platform in a Wyoming town she'd never heard of 3 weeks ago. And the life she had planned for herself was gone. In its place was a quiet man with his hat in his hands and 2 small girls who needed a mother. She had no idea if this was courage or desperation. She suspected it was both, and that maybe that was how most decisions actually got made. "All right," she said. "I'll come." Neither of them shook hands. There wasn't any ceremony to it. She just picked up her suitcase and followed him down the platform steps, and the 2 girls fell in on either side of her without being told to, which she would think about later, alone, when there was time to think. Chester Pruitt watched them go. "Poor man," Margaret Holloway said beside him, meaning it as a slight toward Eliza, not toward Silas. "What's he thinking?" Chester grunted and turned away. He had already stopped thinking about it. The wagon ride out to the valley took nearly 2 hours, and for most of it nobody said much. The girls sat between Eliza and Silas on the bench, and after the first 15 minutes of formal silence, the one called Ruby, she introduced herself with a seriousness that belonged more to a 40-year-old than a 6-year-old, asked Eliza if she knew how to braid hair. "I do," Eliza said. Ruby considered this. "Our papa doesn't know how." "I tried," Silas said, in a tone that suggested it had not gone well. "He used the wrong kind of string," Hazel added. "It was twine," Silas said, with a gravity that made it clear this had been discussed before. "I didn't have ribbon." Eliza looked at the side of his face. He was watching the road with the focused expression of a man who understood he had just revealed something embarrassing about himself and was choosing not to be embarrassed by it. She felt something loosen, slightly, in her chest. "I have ribbon," she said. "In my suitcase." Ruby sat up straighter. "What color?" "Blue and yellow?" "I like blue," Hazel said immediately. "I like yellow," Ruby said. "It's more serious." Eliza looked at Silas again. He still hadn't smiled exactly, but there were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there on the platform. "They've been arguing about which color is more serious for approximately 4 months, he said. "Blue is calm," Hazel said with the authority of someone who had made this argument many times. "Calm is serious." "Yellow is bright," Ruby said. "You have to be serious to be that bright." Eliza thought about this with genuine consideration, because these 2 clearly expected genuine consideration. "I think they're serious in different ways," she said finally. "Blue is serious like a river. Yellow is serious like the sun." Both girls went quiet, processing this. "That's good," Ruby said eventually. "That's very good," Hazel agreed. And just like that, without any formal decision being made about it, Eliza Rowan had passed some kind of examination. The cabin was worse than he had described, and Silas had not described it as good. It sat at the edge of a wide meadow with mountains behind it, and a creek she could hear but not see from the front step, and it was the kind of place that had once been tended carefully and had been let go. The porch railing had a section that had come loose and been propped up rather than repaired. There was a window on the south side with a crack in it that someone had filled with rags. The kitchen garden had been started and abandoned, the rows still visible but choked with weeds that had gotten very comfortable. Silas stopped the wagon and looked at it the way a man looks at something he lives with but doesn't always see clearly. "I said it needed work," he said. "You did," Eliza agreed. "I can fix the railing this week." "I can fix the railing this week," she said, "if you have the nails." He turned and looked at her. Not with surprise exactly, more like recalibration. I have nails, he said. Then we're fine. Inside, the cabin was dim and smelled like wood smoke and the particular melancholy of rooms that haven't had enough people in them. There was a main room with a fireplace and a long table and two small chairs that the girls dropped into immediately, pulling off their shoes with the relieved efficiency of children who have been patient long enough. There was a kitchen that had a good stove and not much else. There were two bedrooms, his and a smaller one where the girls slept in a bed they'd clearly been sharing for some time based on the way the mattress had compressed in the middle. He showed her a curtained alcove off the main room with a narrow cot in it. It's not much, he said. Once the smaller bedroom's set up differently, the girls can have their own. This is fine, she said. He nodded. He was doing that thing again, looking at her like he was revising something he thought he'd understood. I'll make supper, she said, setting her suitcase down beside the cot. You don't have to. You've just arrived. I know I don't have to, she said. I'm going to. She found potatoes and dried beans and half an onion and some salt pork, and she made something out of them that was plain but hot, and she set it on the table while Silas got the girls washed and into their chairs. They ate without much talking, the four of them, but it wasn't the bad kind of quiet. It was the quiet of people who were tired and warm and had food in front of them, and that was enough for one evening. After the girls were in bed, she read to them from a slim book of stories she found on the shelf near the fireplace, and Ruby corrected her on one word which she accepted graciously. She sat at the table and Silas poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her. I want to be clear, he said, about what this is. All right, she said. I'm not offering... He stopped, started over. What I said on the platform. About my girls needing a mother. That's the truth of it. I'm not asking anything more than that from you. You'd have your own space and your own... I'm not asking you to be my wife in any other sense than... Mr. Boone, she said. He stopped. I understood what you were offering, she said. I'm here because I chose to be. I'm not under any illusion about what this is. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. And I'm not fragile. You don't need to handle what you say to me. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, like something had been agreed on. All right, he said. All right, she said. They finished their coffee. He banked the fire. She went behind her curtain and lay down on the narrow cot and listened to the wind come down from the mountains, and she did not cry, which surprised her, because she had fully expected to. She had been rejected in front of strangers. She had traveled 400 miles for a man who looked at her and saw something he couldn't use. She was sleeping in a curtained alcove in a stranger's cabin with $11 and no plan and no people who knew where she was. And lying there in the dark, listening to the wind and the faint sound of the creek she couldn't see, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not happiness, nothing so clean as that. More like the first breath after a long time underwater. More like, I am still here. She woke before Silas did. She heard him moving around the kitchen when it was still dark outside. She heard the careful quietness of a man who had spent 2 years trying not to wake his children. And when she came out from behind the curtain, he was already at the door with his coat on and his hat in his hand, and he stopped when he saw her. You're up? He said. I'm always up early, she said. I'll start the bread. He watched her for a moment. You don't have to... Mr. Boone, she said. He almost smiled. Silas? Silas? She tied her apron. I know I don't have to. He went out. She started the bread. By the time the girls came stumbling out of their room, rubbing their eyes and dragging their blankets, the cabin smelled like something it apparently hadn't smelled like in a long time because Ruby stopped in the middle of the room and sniffed the air with a look of concentrated hope, and then said, Is that bread? It will be, Eliza said. In about an hour. Hazel sat down at the table and put her chin in her hands and looked at Eliza with an expression of deep, assessing calm. Are you going to stay? She asked. The question was simple and enormous. Eliza turned from the stove. Yes, she said. I think I am. Hazel nodded slowly, like something had been confirmed that she had been waiting to have confirmed for longer than one morning. Good, she said. Ruby cries at night sometimes, and Papa doesn't know. Hazel, Ruby said, with the outrage of someone whose private information has been disclosed. It's true, Hazel said. Ruby pressed her lips together and said nothing. Eliza turned back to the stove. She thought about a little girl crying at night in a cold cabin in a Wyoming valley, while her father lay awake in the next room, not knowing, or knowing and not knowing what to do about it, which was its own kind of knowing. She thought about character, about what it required. She set the dough to rise and put the kettle on and began, very quietly, to figure out how to make this place into something that people wanted to come home to. She had no idea that first morning how hard that would be. She had no idea what was still coming. The neighbors who would talk. The winter that would be meaner than anyone warned her. The man on the platform who was not, as it turned out, finished with her yet. She didn't know any of that. She just knew there were 2 little girls at the table and bread rising in the oven and a creek somewhere outside that she still hadn't seen. That was enough to start. The creek, it turned out, was about 40 yards behind the cabin, down a slope that got slippery when the dew was still on the grass. Eliza found it on her 3rd morning at the ranch, before anyone else was awake, following the sound she'd been hearing through the wall since her first night. It wasn't much of a creek, narrow enough to step across in one stride, running cold and fast over a bed of flat stones. But it had a large rock beside it that was exactly the right height for sitting, and she sat on it for about 15 minutes before going back inside to start breakfast. She didn't tell anyone about it. It became her place, the way you find small places inside a life that belong only to you, and you don't explain them because explaining them would change what they are. That was the 3rd morning. By the end of the first week, she had repaired the porch railing, cleared half the kitchen garden, found a crack in the back wall that was letting cold air in behind the flour sacks, and learned that Hazel was the one who went quiet when something was wrong, while Ruby was the one who got loud, and that these were opposite strategies in service of the same feeling, and that you had to treat them differently accordingly. She had also learned that Silas Boone was gone before she got up and back after she'd fed the girls supper, and that he came home carrying the particular exhaustion of a man managing too much alone, and that he ate whatever was on the table without complaint and asked the girls about their day with a focused attention that was one of the better things she had seen in a man, and that he never once in that first week said anything that wasn't necessary. She didn't mind that. She was not a person who required filling silences. What she hadn't expected was the neighbors. The first one came on a Tuesday. A woman named Dora Whitfield, who lived on the next property east, which was close enough in valley terms that she could see the smoke from the Boone chimney on a clear day. Dora arrived in a buckboard with a covered dish and an expression of barely concealed fascination, and she introduced herself at the front door with the specific warmth of a person who wants information and is willing to exchange pleasantries to get it. "You must be the woman from the station," Dora said, holding out the dish. "I brought a pie." Eliza took the pie. "That's kind of you." "Cherry, from last summer's preserves." Dora's eyes moved past her into the cabin with the swift, comprehensive survey of a woman cataloging everything she sees. "My, you've tidied the place up. Last time I was inside this cabin was just after Clara passed, and it was—" She stopped herself with the kind of restraint that suggests the thing she was about to say was not flattering. "Well, Silas wasn't managing well. Understandably." "Clara." Eliza filed the name away. Silas had not mentioned it. "Would you like to come in?" Eliza said. Dora came in. She sat at the table and accepted the coffee Eliza poured her and looked around the kitchen with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite making it. The bread from that morning was still on the counter. The girls' drawings had been tacked to the wall beside the fireplace. The curtains, which had been a washed-out gray when Eliza arrived, were now a cleaner color because she had taken them down and beaten them out and rehung them, which hadn't changed their color dramatically, but had changed the quality of the light coming through them. "Those are Hazel's drawings," Eliza said, following Dora's gaze. "She draws horses mostly. She wants one." "Does she?" Dora wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Are you planning to stay then? Only, forgive me, the situation is a little unusual. We all heard what happened at the station." There it was. "I imagine you did," Eliza said. "Chester Pruitt is not—" Dora paused carefully. He's not a man of much subtlety. What he said was unkind. Most people who were there thought so. And what do most people think about this? Eliza asked. She kept her voice even, not combative. She genuinely wanted to know. Dora had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. People are curious, she said. Silas hasn't had a woman at the ranch since Clara, and you're… She stopped again. A stranger, Eliza supplied, who arrived under difficult circumstances. Yes. Dora seemed relieved to have someone do the work for her. People wonder what your arrangement is. Eliza looked at her directly. I'm here to help care for the girls and keep the house. That's the arrangement. Dora nodded slowly, in the way that meant she was going to repeat this conversation to at least 3 people, and they were all going to form their own opinions regardless. Well, Dora said, finishing her coffee, the pie's good with a little cream if you have it. They didn't have cream. But Eliza thanked her and saw her out and stood on the porch watching the buckboard go, and she thought about the word unusual and how much work that word was being asked to carry. That night, she told Silas about the visit. She told him plainly, without editorializing, the way she'd learned was the way he preferred to receive information. He was quiet for a moment. The fire had burned low and the girls were in bed and the cabin had settled into its nighttime sounds. Dora means well, he said finally. I think she does, Eliza agreed. I also think half the valley is going to come by this week with covered dishes and questions. Probably, he said. He was looking at the fire. Does that bother you? She thought about it honestly. I don't particularly enjoy being someone else's subject of interest, she said, but I'd rather they came here and saw for themselves than made up their own version of it. He turned and looked at her, and again she caught that expression she'd noticed on the platform. Not quite surprise, more like revision. That's sensible, he said. I have my moments, she said. He almost smiled again. The almost smile was becoming something she noticed. She went behind her curtain and he banked the fire and the cabin went quiet. And outside the wind was doing its thing along the ridge. And Eliza lay there thinking about a woman named Clara, whose curtains she was sleeping under, and whose children she was braiding ribbon into the hair of. And she thought about what it meant to step into the shape of someone else's absence. She thought, I'm not trying to replace her. That's not what this is. She wasn't sure yet what it was, but she knew what it wasn't. 3 more neighbors came that week. 2 of them brought food. 1 of them brought only curiosity, which she offered without a container. Eliza was polite to all of them. She answered the questions that were reasonable and redirected the ones that weren't, and she made coffee and accepted the covered dishes and showed them the kitchen garden she was reclaiming row by row, and by the end of the week she could tell the tide had shifted slightly, not to warmth exactly, but to a watchful willingness to be convinced. What actually helped, she thought later, was the bread. She baked every other day, more than the 4 of them needed, and what was left she sent with Silas to whatever fence he was mending or field he was clearing, and the ranch hands who worked the adjacent properties started having opinions about Eliza Rowan that were not based on what Chester Pruitt had said on a platform. They were based on the bread, which was substantial and not overly sweet and lasted 3 days without going hard, which in ranch country in Wyoming was not a small thing. Burl Hadley told me this morning your bread was the best he'd had since his mother died, Silas said one evening without preamble over supper. Eliza looked up from her plate. That's either a great compliment or very sad. Both, probably, he said. Who's Burl Hadley? Works the south end of the Miller spread. He's about 60 years old and he's been eating his own cooking for 20 years. That explains the enthusiasm, she said. Ruby looked between them with interest. Is Burl Hadley the one with the big gray horse? That's him, Silas said. I drew that horse, Hazel said. It's on the wall. I know it is, Silas said. Hazel leaned forward with the intensity of someone making an important point. I would take good care of a horse. We've discussed this, Silas said in a tone that meant they'd discussed it many times. We could discuss it again, Hazel said. Eliza bit the inside of her cheek to keep her expression neutral, and across the table she caught Silas doing the same thing, and for one moment they were 2 people sharing the private comedy of a 6-year-old who negotiated like a land lawyer, and it was the first time she'd felt anything close to ease with him. It passed quickly, as those moments do. but it stayed with her. The second week was harder than the first in the ways that mattered, and easier in the ways that were practical. Practically, she had a routine now. She knew the rhythm of the cabin and the girls, knew that Ruby needed 15 minutes of quiet after waking up before she was fit for conversation, and that Hazel woke up already mid-thought on whatever she'd been thinking about the night before. She knew that the stove ran hot on the left side and that the flour bin had a loose bottom she'd packed with paper to stop the draft. She knew that Silas took his coffee without anything and drank it standing up, and that he'd come back in around midday if he was working close to the cabin, and that on the days he didn't come back in, the girls started watching the door around 4 in the afternoon with a careful casualness that meant they were doing no such thing. What made it harder was the thing she hadn't anticipated. She was starting to care about them. Not in the way she'd expected to care. Competently, responsibly, from an appropriate professional distance. She was starting to care the way you care about people when you've seen them be small and tired and not at their best. When you've sat with a child at 2 in the morning because she woke up crying and didn't know why. Which happened on the 9th night when Ruby's crying came through the curtain and Eliza was up before she'd fully decided to be. She sat on the edge of the girl's bed in the dark and put her hand on Ruby's back and said nothing, just let the warmth of her hand communicate whatever words couldn't, and after a while the crying slowed and Ruby turned over and looked at her in the dark with wet eyes and said, "I dreamed about Mama." Eliza didn't say anything for a moment. "Tell me about her," she said finally. Ruby thought about it. "She smelled like lavender. She had a song she used to sing that I can't remember all the way through anymore. I remember the beginning, but the middle is gone." Her voice caught on that last part. The middle is gone. In a way that made Eliza understand that this was the specific grief, not the general one. The terror of forgetting. "I'm scared I'm going to forget the beginning too." "What's the beginning?" Eliza asked. Ruby sang it, barely above a whisper, 4 or 5 notes of something simple. Eliza listened. "Then what?" Eliza said. "Then I don't know." "That's all right," Eliza said. "You remember the beginning? That's not nothing." "What if I forget it?" Eliza put her hand on Ruby's hair. "Then you'll remember that you loved her. That doesn't go anywhere." Ruby looked at her, 6 years old, with her mother's absence living inside her like a missing tooth she kept finding with her tongue. "How do you know?" she asked. Eliza thought about her own mother, about wildflowers pressed in a Bible, about the way certain smells still hit her sideways when she wasn't prepared for them. "I know," she said simply. Ruby seemed to decide this was sufficient. She turned over and pressed her face into the pillow and went back to sleep with the speed that children have. And Eliza sat on the edge of the bed a little longer in the dark, listening to both girls breathe. When she came back out into the main room, Silas was standing at the fireplace with his back to her. He'd heard, or some of it. She could tell by the set of his shoulders, the particular tension of a parent who has listened to their child in pain from outside the room and couldn't be the right person to go in. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. She went behind her curtain and he stood at the fireplace a while longer, and in the morning neither of them mentioned it, but something had changed in the way he looked at her. Something had been added that hadn't been there before, and she felt it without knowing what to call it. The garden was her project in the way that the fence repairs were his, something to put your hands on when your mind needed somewhere useful to go. She cleared the remaining weeds in the first week and turned the soil in the second, working in the mornings while the girls did their lessons at the kitchen table. She'd taken over the lessons almost by accident when she realized on the second day that Silas had been trying to teach them from a single primer while managing the ranch, which meant they were both behind where they should be and confused about it in different ways. Ruby had memorized things she didn't understand. Hazel understood things she hadn't memorized. Eliza sorted them out over the course of a week, sitting between them at the table, and whatever Silas had been attempting to do in the evenings got easier once someone had untangled the knot in the daytime. "Where did you learn to teach?" he asked her one night. The question was straightforward, without implication. He asked things that way, directly, without the social padding that most people used. "I didn't learn," she said. "I just paid attention to how they think." "That is how you learn to teach," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, not at her, but there was something careful in the way he'd said it, something she recognized as close to a compliment from a man who gave them the way. A careful person spends money they can't afford to lose. I had a good teacher myself, she said. My mother. She died when I was 20. I'm sorry, he said. She had a good long illness, so we had time to say what needed saying, Eliza said. Not everyone gets that. She wasn't sure why she'd told him that. It came out before she'd weighed it. He was quiet for a moment. Clara went fast, he said. Then he stopped like he hadn't meant to say it. She waited. Fever, he said. She was fine in the morning. She was gone by the following evening. I was in the south field. He said it the way you say something you've turned over so many times it's worn smooth, the facts of it no longer sharp, but the shape still there. The girls were with Dora Whitfield. They didn't understand what had happened for about a week. Then Hazel understood all at once, and Ruby understood slowly, and I was... He stopped again. His hands on the table were still. I wasn't managing. Dora was right about that. Eliza looked at his hands, looked at his face. You were managing, she said. Just not well. He looked up at her. There's a difference, she said. Not managing is lying down. You didn't lie down. You kept the ranch, kept the girls, kept going. That counts. He held her gaze for longer than he usually did. Chester Pruitt is an idiot, he said. It came out abruptly, not seeking from anything, and she understood that he'd been wanting to say it for a while. I should have said that at the station. I didn't because it wasn't my business, and I don't usually... He stopped. It was unkind what he said, publicly, where you couldn't... It's all right, she said. It isn't, he said. She thought about arguing with him and decided not to. He was right, and they both knew it, and sometimes the right thing was to let someone say a true thing without making it easier for them. No, she said. I suppose it isn't. Something passed between them in the quiet. Not dramatic, nothing you could point to, just the small recalibration of two people arriving at a more honest ground. She went to bed. He banked the fire. By the fourth week, the kitchen garden had her first visible rows of green, onion shoots mostly, a little ragged, but real. And the cabin had the smell of inhabited warmth that comes not from any single thing, but from the accumulation of small daily efforts. Bread and wood smoke and the particular clean cotton smell of sheets dried in outdoor air. The porch railing held. The window no longer had rags in the crack because Eliza had found proper caulk in the shed and applied it on a dry afternoon while the girls watched and asked questions and handed her things she didn't need but took anyway because being included mattered more than efficiency. Word had spread through the valley in the way that words spread in places with few people in long winters. Not maliciously, mostly, just with the unstoppable momentum of there being nothing else to talk about. The woman from the station, the plain woman Pruitt wouldn't have. She'd gone with Silas Boone. She was raising those twin girls of his. She made bread. Opinions varied. Dora Whitfield, who had come back twice more and was now something approaching genuine in her warmth, told Eliza with some satisfaction that Mrs. Greer at the dry goods had said it was a strange situation. And I told her, Dora said, that I had been inside the Boone cabin 3 weeks ago, and the girls looked better than they'd looked since Clara died. And if that was strange, then strange was working. Eliza thanked her. I also told her about the bread, Dora added. She wants to know if you'd be willing to sell it. Eliza considered this. I don't need to sell bread, she said. She doesn't need to buy it, Dora said, but it would give people a reason to stop in. Eliza understood what she was really offering, a way to make the arrangement legible to the valley, a reason for the wagon to come by that wasn't gossip, something that let people come meet her on terms that felt normal. Tell her I'll send a loaf on Wednesdays, Eliza said. No charge, but I'll take flour in return if she has extra. Dora smiled in a way that meant this was exactly the right answer. It was the kind of social negotiation that Eliza had always been capable of, but rarely had occasion to use in Ohio, where her world had been small and her social position was fixed. Here, for reasons that were not comfortable to sit with directly, she had more room. The circumstances that had been humiliating, the rejection, the public nature of it, the strange half-arrangement she'd landed in, had made her visible in a way she'd never been before. And visibility, she was learning, could be worked with. She wasn't naive about it. She knew the whispers hadn't stopped. She knew some people in the valley looked at her arrangement with Silas and assigned meanings to it that weren't there. She knew that Chester Pruitt's dismissal of her had lodged in some people's minds as a data point, a fact about her worth that they held quietly while remaining polite. She knew all of this, and she did the work anyway, because the work was what she had. The thing she didn't expect, the thing that arrived quietly and without announcement, the way the most significant things tend to, was the moment with Silas in the barn on a cold Thursday in the 5th week, when she had come to bring him his noon meal because he'd been out since before light and the temperature had dropped since morning. He was working on a piece of harness leather at the workbench, hands moving with the competent automaticity of someone doing something they've done 10,000 times. He heard her come in and looked up, and she set the food down on the bench beside him, and he thanked her, and then he said, not looking at her, still working the leather, "The Hendersons are having a gathering Saturday, over at their place. It's not formal. They do it every fall." Eliza waited. "People from the valley come," he said. "I usually don't go, since Clara." He paused, kept his hands moving. "Hazel's been asking. She wants to see the Henderson girls. They're about her age." "Then you should take them," Eliza said. He was quiet for a moment. "I thought you might—" He stopped, started again. "It would be easier, if you came." She looked at the side of his face. He was not a man who found asking easy. This was the most she'd heard him use to say something he could have said in 10 words. "All right," she said. He nodded and went back to the harness. She left him to his food. Walking back to the cabin, she thought about the word easier and the work it was being asked to carry, and she thought it was doing rather a lot. The gathering was in the evening, and they went in the wagon, all 4 of them, the girls sitting in the back wrapped in a quilt because the nights had turned cold. The Henderson place was lit up warm from across the field, and the sound of people talking and a fiddle starting up came through the dark ahead of them. Ruby and Hazel were out of the back of the wagon before it had fully stopped, running toward the sound with the headlong confidence of children who have been indoor too long. Silas watched them go, then climbed down from the bench and came around to offer his hand for the step down, which he hadn't done before. She took it. His hand was calloused and dry and large, and he let go of it the moment she was on the ground. They walked toward the light side by side, not touching, not talking, and she was aware of the moment they crossed through the doorway into the warmth and noise, and the faces turned toward them, the brief flicker of recognition and recalibration that moved through the room, that Silas Boone and the woman from the station, and she held her chin level and kept walking. What happened next surprised her. The first person to come over was a tall woman named Helen Price, who had not come to the cabin and had not sent a dish, and had not, as far as Eliza knew, formed any particular opinion of her yet. Helen walked over and said, "You're the Rowan woman." And Eliza said yes, and Helen said, "My husband says your bread is the best thing that's happened to this valley since the railroad," and laughed at her own exaggeration. And Eliza laughed too because it was funny, and because laughing in a room full of strangers was better than not laughing. Silas stood slightly behind her and to the left, and she couldn't see his face, but she could feel something relax in him, some held tension releasing, and she understood what she was for him in this room. Not a wife, not yet any kind of partner in the full sense, but a reason to be present, a reason to stop being the man who stayed home since Clara. She danced once, with Burl Hadley, who turned out to be exactly as described, 60 years old, 2 decades of his own cooking, deeply sincere about bread. And she was not a graceful dancer, but she was a willing one. And by the end of the evening, she had spoken to most of the people in the room and been spoken to in return as though she was simply a person at a gathering rather than a situation to be assessed. On the way home, the girls fell asleep in the back under the quilt before they'd gone half a mile. The night was clear and cold, and the stars were very close, the way they get at altitude, and the horse moved steady on the dark road. Silas said after a while, "Thank you for coming." "I wanted to," she said, and realized saying it that she meant it. He was quiet for the rest of the ride, but it was a different quality of quiet than it had been before. Less defended, somehow, less alone. She noticed that too. When they got home and got the girls to bed, she heated the last of the coffee and they sat at the table briefly before sleep, and he looked at her across the rim of his cup and said simply, "You're good with people." "I wasn't always," she said. "What changed?" She thought about it. About Ohio, about her mother, about a man on a platform who had looked at her and found her inadequate. I stopped waiting for people to decide I was worth talking to, she said, and started talking anyway. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that somewhere. She went behind her curtain. He banked the fire. And outside, the creek kept running in the dark behind the cabin, cold and fast over its flat stones, the same as it had been every night since she arrived, the same as it had been long before she arrived, long before Silas Boone had built anything on this land at all. Steady and indifferent, and in its way, reliable. The kind of thing you could count on, the kind of thing that kept going regardless. She was starting to feel, slowly and without any dramatic announcement, that she might be becoming one of those things too. Winter arrived in Silver Hollow Valley the way it always did in that part of Wyoming. Not gradually, not with any courtesy of warning, but all at once on a Tuesday in late October when the temperature dropped 20 degrees between breakfast and noon, and the sky went the color of old pewter, and stayed that way. Eliza had been told the winters were hard. She had not fully understood what that meant until she understood it from the inside. The first snow came that Tuesday afternoon, light at first, the kind that made the girls press their faces to the window glass and breathe fog onto it. By the following morning, there were 8 inches on the ground and Silas was out before 4, and Eliza was up at 5 to get the stove burning hot enough that the cabin was warm by the time the girls woke. She burned through wood faster than she'd anticipated. She made a mental note and kept making it every day until she mentioned it to Silas at supper, and he nodded and said he'd get more cut, and she could see in his face that he'd already been calculating it and coming up short on hours in the day. "I can help split it," she said. He looked at her, not doubtfully exactly, but with the expression of a man weighing something. "I know how to swing an axe," she said. "My father wasn't good for much, but he did teach me that." He nodded after a moment. "Saturday morning," he said. "I'll show you where the good pieces are." She showed up Saturday with her coat and her gloves and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he showed her the woodpile without commentary, and they worked side by side for 2 hours in the cold, and she was slower than him, but she wasn't useless. And when they stacked what they'd split against the cabin wall, he stood back and looked at it and said, "That'll carry us through January if we're careful." "Then we'll be careful," she said. He picked up his axe. "You've got a good swing," he said, "straight down." It was the most direct compliment he had ever paid her, and she felt it warm her in a way that had nothing to do with the physical work. She didn't say anything about it. She just picked up her own axe and carried it back to the shed. The winter settled in around the cabin like it was trying to make a point. December brought ice on the creek. Her creek, the Sitting Rock, all of it locked under a gray-white crust, and the wind off the ridge at night made sounds against the cabin walls that the girls had apparently learned to sleep through, but that Eliza lay awake listening to until she learned them too. She learned the difference between the wind being dangerous and the wind just being loud. It took about 3 weeks. She kept busy in the ways available to her. She mended everything that needed mending, which was considerable. She taught the girls through the short gray days, reading first, then numbers, then the history she remembered from her own schooling, which was patchy in places but better than nothing. She wrote letters, 3 of them, to women she'd known in Ohio, although she wasn't sure what to say in them, and what she wrote felt thin and insufficient when she read it back. She didn't send 2 of them. The third one she sent to a woman named Pauline, her mother's old friend, because Pauline was the kind of person who would understand a situation without needing it fully explained, and Eliza needed someone to understand without explanation. Pauline wrote back in January. The letter took 3 weeks to arrive. It said, among other things, "You always had more courage than you gave yourself credit for, Eliza. Your mother knew it. I'm glad someone else is finding it out." Eliza read that sentence twice, folded the letter, and put it in the pocket of her dress for the rest of the day. The girls were changing in ways that were slow and daily, and therefore invisible, until suddenly they weren't. Hazel, who had started the autumn with the gravely serious self-containment of a child who had learned that the adult world was unreliable, had started showing cracks in it. Small ones, moments of pure silliness that surprised even herself, like she'd forgotten she wasn't supposed to be silly, and then remembered too late and was already laughing. Ruby, who had always been the louder one, had gotten paradoxically quieter in some ways, more deliberate, as though she was conducting a careful experiment on the question of whether people stayed. They both still cried sometimes. Not as often. And when they did, they came to Eliza. She wasn't sure exactly when that had shifted, when she had moved from being the woman who was there to being the person they came to. She thought it probably happened the way most important things happen. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small moments, each one too minor to notice, until the weight of them together had moved something large. Silas noticed. She could tell he noticed by the way he watched it happen from across the room on the evenings when one of the girls came to sit beside Eliza rather than beside him, and the expression on his face was complicated, grateful, and something else she couldn't name, something with more weight to it, something she was careful not to look at too directly. They had developed, over the months, a way of talking to each other that was easy and not easy at the same time. Easy in that the silences between them were no longer uncomfortable, in that she knew his cadence and he knew hers, and that they could disagree about how to handle something with the girls, about the right time to attempt a fence repair, about whether the left side of the stove was actually hotter, or whether she was imagining it, without either of them taking it badly. Not easy in that there were things they didn't say, that existed in the spaces around their conversations like furniture in a dark room that you knew was there and moved around without pointing at. She didn't think about the not easy parts too much. She was practical about most things, and practicality meant focusing on what was in front of her. What was in front of her in February was a bad week. One of those weeks where everything went wrong in the small grinding way that wears at a person more than one large disaster. The stove's flue got partially blocked, and the kitchen filled with smoke until Silas climbed up in the bitter cold to clear it and came down red-faced and coughing. Ruby got a chest cold that went on longer than it should have and kept the whole cabin up 3 nights running. A window latch on the back broke and let cold air knife through until Silas rigged a temporary fix that was ugly but worked. Eliza ran out of a particular spice she'd been using, and it was stupid. It didn't matter. But she stood in the kitchen on a Thursday looking at the empty jar and felt, briefly and with some embarrassment, like crying. She didn't cry. She made supper without it and nobody complained. But Silas looked at her across the table that evening with the focused attention he usually kept for things that required fixing and said, "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said automatically. He waited. "It's a small thing," she said. "I'm out of nutmeg. The porridge isn't... It's fine. I know it's fine." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to Sutter's store on Friday," he said. "I'll get it." "You don't have to..." "I know I don't have to," he said. And it was the first time he'd used her own phrase back at her, and she caught it, and she thought he knew she'd caught it, and there was a moment between them that was small and warm and domestic in a way that felt like something she hadn't known she was hungry for. He got the nutmeg on Friday. He put it on the counter without ceremony when he came home, and she said thank you, and he said nothing, and went to see about the horse, and she stood in the kitchen holding a small jar of nutmeg and understood, dimly and without letting herself examine it, that something had been happening in this cabin all winter that she had not fully accounted for. March came slowly, and with it the first signs of the season breaking. Not warmth yet, not real warmth, but a softening. The light changed quality. The creek, when she went to it, had opened up along one edge, the water moving fast and dark under the thinning ice. The first brave and probably confused birds showed up in the cottonwood near the barn, and the girls were fascinated by them to a degree that surprised Eliza until she realized they hadn't seen anything new in 4 months. By April, the valley was opening up, and with that opening came movement, wagons on the road again, neighbors visible in their fields, the general resumption of valley life after its winter suspension. Dora Whitfield came by on a bright April morning and sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and looked around the cabin with an expression that was no longer cataloging. She'd cataloged everything months ago, but something more like simple appreciation. "The girls look wonderful," Dora said. "Ruby's grown at least 2 inches since October." "At least," Eliza agreed. "And Silas..." Dora paused, choosing words. "He was at the Henderson place last week, helping with the fence mending. Helen said he seemed..." She said he seemed like himself again, like before Clara. Eliza looked at her coffee. "I'm glad," she said, and meant it without reservation, which was its own complicated thing to examine later. Dora set down her cup. "You've done something good here," she said. "I want you to know..." that I know that. Eliza looked up. I've made bread and taught 2 girls their letters, she said. I don't know that it required much credit. Dora smiled, small and knowing. You understand what I mean, she said. Eliza did. She just wasn't sure what to do with it. It was the first week of May when it happened. She had come back from the creek in the early morning, the way she did on the days when the light was good, and she had a few minutes before the cabin woke up, and she was coming up the slope to the back of the cabin when she heard a horse on the road. Horses on the road were ordinary, more ordinary now than they'd been in winter, and she didn't pay it particular attention until she came around the side of the cabin and saw it was a horse she recognized. She stopped. Chester Pruitt was tying his horse to the porch post. He hadn't changed noticeably in 7 months. He was still broad and sunburned and dressed well relative to the people around him, with the careful appearance of a man who thought about how he looked because he believed it mattered. He had his hat in his hand and he was looking at the cabin, at the straight new railing, the clean windows, the kitchen garden which was already showing green in the early May warmth, with an expression she couldn't read from this distance. He heard her on the path and turned. She stood still. Miss Rowan, he said. Then, as if correcting something, Eliza. She had not given him permission to use her given name. She noticed this but said nothing about it. Mr. Pruitt, she said. She kept walking toward the porch because to stop walking would be to cede something, and she was finished ceding things to this man. I'd like to speak with you, he said. I can see that, she said. Silas isn't here. He wasn't. He'd been gone since before light, as usual. I know, Chester said. And this, she registered, what was information? He had timed this. She stopped at the porch steps, one below him looking up. What is it you want? He turned his hat in his hands, the same gesture Silas had made on the platform 7 months ago, she noticed, and found it remarkable that it communicated such different things. On Silas, it had been an honest tell, a man working himself up to something difficult. On Chester, it looked practiced. I owe you an apology, he said. What I said at the station was, I said it badly. I was surprised, is all. He paused, and she watched him select his words the way a man selects his footing on uncertain ground. The description I'd had of you wasn't what I expected. You said you couldn't marry that, Eliza said, in front of 30 people. He winced. It was a genuine wince. He had the capacity for embarrassment. She could see that much. I know what I said. Then you know an apology for how you said it doesn't quite cover it. He looked at her directly. There was something working in his face that she thought might, in another man in different circumstances, qualify as contrition. You're right, he said. It was wrong of me, all of it. She waited. I heard about the ranch, he said, and here his voice shifted, became less careful, more direct in a way that felt closer to the truth of why he was standing on this porch. I heard about what it's become. People in the valley talk about this place now like... He stopped. You've done something here. The girls and Silas and I have done something here, she said precisely. He acknowledged this with a slight nod that didn't quite concede it. I came because I want to make you an offer. He said it plainly, without dressing it up. My place is larger than this, better furnished. I have a foreman who handles the heavy work. You wouldn't have to split wood or mend fence or any of it. I can offer you comfort, Eliza. Real comfort, a proper household. She heard everything he was saying and everything he wasn't. You want me to come to your ranch, she said. I want you to consider it. He met her eyes. I made a mistake. People make mistakes. They do, she said. It would be a different life. He gestured slightly toward the cabin behind her. Better than this. There was a sound from inside. Ruby's voice, then Hazel's, then the particular thud of children getting out of bed with their customary lack of grace, and then feet on the floor and the girls' voices getting louder as they moved toward the kitchen. Eliza heard the stove grate. They'd been learning to bank it overnight, both of them old enough now. And then Hazel's voice calling out, Eliza, are you already up? She turned her head toward the door. Out here, she called. Get dressed first.
There was a pause, and then the particular sound of mild outrage that Hazel made when her plans were adjusted. Chester was watching her. "It's not a bad life," she said, turning back to him. "What you're describing." "No," he said. "It isn't." "You're right that you have more." She said it evenly, without resentment. "More land, more money, more comfort by most measures." He seemed to take this as encouragement, and she saw it happen in his face, the small brightening, and she let it happen because it would make the next part clearer. "But you're asking me to leave 2 children who call me by name," she said. "You're asking me to leave a man who—" She stopped, assembled the sentence correctly. "You're asking me to leave a life I built for a life that is better furnished, and I don't think those 2 things are equivalent." His face stilled. "You care for them," he said, and he meant it as a concession to her sentiment, as if she'd given him a detail to work around. "Yes," she said simply. "But they're not yours," he said. "They're his." And this was the sentence that did it, that closed something in her that had perhaps still been slightly open. "They are mine," she said, "in the way that matters." Chester looked at her for a long moment. She saw the calculation running behind his eyes, saw him trying to find the angle, the lever, the offer she hadn't refused yet, and she watched him arrive at the understanding that there wasn't one. "You're making a choice based on sentiment," he said, not cruelly, but flatly. A man stating a fact he found incomprehensible. "I'm making a choice based on what I value," she said. "Those are different things." The door opened behind her and both girls appeared on the porch, half-dressed, Hazel with her hair already in the 2 braids Eliza had done the night before, and Ruby with hers still loose, and they looked at Chester Pruitt with the frank, unguarded appraisal of children who had not yet learned to pretend they weren't looking. "Who's that?" Ruby asked. "Someone who was just leaving," Eliza said. Chester put his hat on. He looked at the girls, then at Eliza, then around once more at the ranch, the garden, the new gate on the barn, the woodpile they'd stacked in winter. And she saw something move through his face that was almost longing, though she wasn't certain he could have named what it was he was longing for. "If you change your mind," he said. "I won't," she said. He untied his horse. He mounted without another word and rode back up the road, and she stood on the porch watching him go until she couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore. Ruby had pressed up against her left side without ceremony. Hazel was on the right, leaning into her arm. "Was he mean?" Hazel asked. Eliza considered this. "He was someone who learned something too late," she said. "That's different." "What did he learn?" Ruby asked. "That how something looks from the outside," Eliza said, "isn't the thing that makes it worth having." Neither girl fully understood this, and she hadn't expected them to, but they accepted it with the equanimity of children who've learned that adults occasionally say things that are meant for themselves. She stood on the porch a while longer after they'd gone back inside. She could hear them in the kitchen, the stove, the ordinary sounds, and she breathed the May air which still had cold in it, but also the smell of turned earth and the something green that comes up from the valley floor when the season decides it's ready. She wasn't prepared for what came next, and she would recognize later that she should have been, because the valley talked, and the valley had talked about Chester Pruitt's visit by nightfall, had talked about it with the speed and thoroughness of a place where interesting things were still rare enough to be properly appreciated. She didn't know this yet when Silas came home that evening, later than usual, and set down his coat and washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the table with the specific quality of silence that meant he'd heard something and was trying to decide how to carry it. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted long enough to change the air in the room slightly, and then he nodded, that single complete nod that was his whole register of significant things, and he picked up his fork and resumed eating. Ruby exhaled loudly beside her. "Good," Ruby said with emphasis. "Ruby," Silas said. "I'm just saying," Ruby said. "I know what you're saying," he said. "It's logical," Hazel said serenely. "Eat your supper," Silas said. They ate. Under the table, Ruby's foot briefly touched Eliza's, the way children make contact without making a production of it, and Eliza pressed her foot back gently and said nothing. But the visit had disturbed something in the valley's water,
and she felt it in the days that followed in ways she hadn't anticipated. People who had been warming to her now seemed to take fresh stock, not negatively, but as if Chester's appearance had reminded them that the situation was a situation, had reopened the question of what exactly Eliza Rowan was at the Boone Ranch and what she intended and what Silas Boone was doing with her there. The whispers went around again, and this time they had a new shape to them, because Chester Pruitt wanting something tended to make people reconsider whether they'd been undervaluing it. Dora Whitfield arrived 2 days after Chester's visit, not with a covered dish this time, but with a direct expression and both hands empty, which meant she had come to talk rather than to be sociable. "People are asking questions again," Dora said, settling into her chair at the kitchen table. "I imagined they would be," Eliza said. She poured the coffee. "Chester's been at Sutter's store telling his version of the conversation." Dora wrapped her hands around the cup. "His version is that he made a generous offer and you have a romantic attachment to Silas that's clouding your judgment." Eliza set down the coffee pot. "He said that." "More or less." Dora looked at her steadily. "Is there any truth to it?" The kitchen was quiet except for the stove. The girls were outside in the garden. She could hear them arguing about something in the distant, amiable way they argued when nothing was really wrong. Eliza sat down across from Dora. "I think," she said carefully, "that it's a convenient story for a man who can't understand that a woman chose something other than what he was offering." Dora held her gaze. "That's an answer to a different question than the one I asked." Eliza looked at her coffee. "I know," she said. Dora was quiet for a moment. Then, with the gentleness of a woman who has been married 20 years and knows something about the territory. "Does Silas know?" "Know what?" "Eliza." She looked up. "He's not oblivious," Dora said. "He's quiet, and people mistake that for not noticing. But he notices everything." She paused. "The question is whether you've both been waiting on the other one long enough that you've convinced yourselves there's nothing there." Eliza said nothing for a long time. Outside, Hazel's voice rose briefly in outrage. Ruby had apparently done something to the bean row, and then subsided. "I came here for the girls," Eliza said finally. "You did," Dora said. "And you stayed for—" She didn't finish the question. She didn't need to. Eliza wrapped both hands around her cup and didn't answer, because the answer was a thing she'd been carrying around for months without looking at it directly, and looking at it directly now. In this kitchen, with the morning light coming through her clean curtains and the sound of the girls outside, and Silas's coat hanging on the hook by the door where it had hung all winter. She looked at it, and it was what it was. She didn't say any of this to Dora. Dora was a good woman, but she was also the Valley's most efficient circulation system for information, and this was not something Eliza was prepared to circulate. She thanked Dora for coming and saw her out with warm enough parting words that Dora left satisfied, and then she stood on the porch in the May morning watching Dora's buckboard go and thinking about what it meant to know something you'd been not knowing for months. The trouble with knowing it was that it changed how she moved through the cabin. Changed the way she was aware of the space between herself and Silas at the table, the way she heard his footsteps in the morning, the particular way he sometimes paused in the doorway of whatever room she was in, just a half second, barely there, before he went about whatever he'd come to do. She had been good at not seeing it. She was less good at not seeing it now. And Chester Pruitt had not been wrong about one thing, even if he'd been wrong about everything else. Things were going to have to be named eventually. The arrangement that had been sufficient in November was straining in May, not because anything had gone wrong, but because something had quietly gone more right than either of them had planned for. And the shape that had been enough in the beginning was no longer the shape of what was actually there. She thought about what Silas had asked her across the table that evening. Why? She thought about what she'd said. Because this is where I belong. She had meant it simply, as a fact, when she said it. But sitting with it now, in the May morning, with the creek running somewhere behind the cabin and the kitchen garden coming up in its rows and Hazel and Ruby's voices in the distance, she understood that belonging was not a static thing. It was not a place you arrived at and then simply occupied. It was something that kept deepening, kept asking more of you, kept making it harder to imagine ever having been anywhere else. She had come to Silver Hollow with $11 and a cracked heart, and someone else's expectations of her life. She had found something else entirely. What she hadn't figured out yet was what to do about the part of it that was sitting in Silas's kitchen every night, looking at his hands on the table and feeling things she hadn't signed up to feel and didn't have a name for that didn't sound like too much. She hadn't figured that out. But she thought about it, standing on the porch in the May morning. She thought about it a great deal. She didn't do anything about it in May. That was the honest accounting of it. She identified the thing and then set it carefully to the side and went on working, because the working was what she knew how to do, and the other things she didn't, not yet, not with any confidence. June came in warm and fast. The kitchen garden that had been rows of cautious green in May became something real in June. Onions with good tops, bean plants climbing their stakes, the herbs she'd seeded in the cold frame coming up dense and fragrant. She cut the first herbs on a Tuesday morning and tied them to dry in the kitchen window. And when Silas came in at midday, he stopped and looked at them hanging there, and something passed across his face that was private, that she almost looked away from, because she understood without being told that Clara had dried herbs in that window too. She didn't say anything about it. He didn't either. But he stood there a moment longer than necessary before he went to wash his hands, and she thought that some griefs were so woven into the fabric of a place that you couldn't renovate your way around them. You just had to let them be there, alongside the new things, and trust that eventually they'd find a way to coexist. Chester Pruitt did not come back. She heard his name occasionally, valley gossip being what it was. His version of events had circulated and returned to her in distorted forms, each retelling adding something new until the story bore only a family resemblance to what had actually happened on that porch in May. She let it go. The people whose opinions mattered had heard the actual version from her or from Silas, and the people who preferred Chester's version were going to prefer it regardless of evidence. What she hadn't anticipated was Margaret Holloway. Margaret arrived on a Wednesday in the second week of June, alone, without a covered dish or any pretense of a social call. She arrived in a good dress and a careful expression and tied her horse to the post with the precision of someone who has rehearsed what comes next. Eliza was in the garden and saw her coming up the road and felt the particular quality of alertness that comes with recognizing a specific kind of visitor, one who is not coming because she wants to, but because she's decided she must. "Mrs. Holloway," Eliza said, peeling off her garden gloves. Margaret stopped a few feet from the garden fence. She looked at Eliza the way she'd looked at her on the platform in October, with that cataloging assessment. But something in it was different now, less certain. "I should have come sooner," Margaret said. "What I said at the station, what I helped make happen. I've been thinking about it." Eliza waited. "I told Chester you wouldn't be suitable," Margaret said. "Before you even stepped off the train. I'd read his description of you in a letter he showed at supper one night, and I told him—" She stopped, reset. "I told him he could do better. That was my word. Better." She said it like it tasted bad. "He listened to me, and then he said what he said in front of everyone, and I—" She paused. "I laughed. At the time. I want you to know that I know that." Eliza was quiet for a moment. She looked at Margaret Holloway, the careful dress, the hands that weren't quite still, and she tried to locate what she felt, which was complicated. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. "It's been 8 months." "Because I've driven past this ranch every week since October," Margaret said, "and I've watched it change. I've watched those girls change, and I thought—" Her voice tightened slightly. "I thought someone should say it plainly. I was wrong. What I did was wrong." Eliza looked at her garden fence for a moment. "I appreciate you saying it," she said. And then, because she was honest to a fault and because Margaret had been honest first, it hurt. What happened on that platform? Not just what Chester said, though that was its own particular thing, but the laughing. That was the part that— She stopped. "I know," Margaret said quietly. "It made me a joke," Eliza said. "In front of strangers, in a town I'd never been to. That was what I walked into this valley carrying." "I know," Margaret said again. They looked at each other for a moment, two women on either side of a garden fence with 8 months of history between them that neither had chosen. "All right," Eliza said. Thank you for coming. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and they both understood that, but it was something. An acknowledgement that the account existed and that Margaret Holloway had enough honesty in her to come and make it, which was, Eliza thought, more than a lot of people managed. Margaret left. Eliza put her garden gloves back on and went back to work. She told Silas about it that evening, briefly, plainly, the way she told him most things, and he listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened. Margaret Holloway, he said when she finished. Yes. That took something, he said. It did, Eliza agreed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Does it help? Hearing it? She thought about this honestly. Some, she said. The thing she said doesn't unhappen, but knowing she knows she was wrong, yes, some. He nodded. They sat with this. Can I ask you something? He said. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, which was what he did when he was working toward a difficult thing. Of course, she said. When you came here, he said. What were you hoping for? He looked up then. Not what you expected. What you hoped. It was the most personal question he had ever asked her. She felt it land with a kind of weight that she respected, that she didn't want to answer quickly. I don't know that I let myself hope for specifics, she said. I hoped for something that felt real, something I'd helped make. She paused. I'd spent a long time being in other people's homes, my father's, then the families I sewed for. I wanted something that was mine in some sense, even if the circumstances were. She gestured slightly at the room around them, meaning the arrangement, the strangeness of how it had come about. Even if they were unconventional. He held her gaze. And is this? He stopped, started differently. Is this what you hoped for? She looked at him for a moment. More than I hoped for, she said, and heard herself say it and felt the truth of it settle in her chest like something finally put down after being carried a long way. Something moved in his face. She watched it happen. Not the almost smile, something slower and more serious than that. Good, he said. Quietly, the way he said things that mattered. And then he looked back at the table and she looked back at hers, and neither of them said anything else that evening, but the air in the room had changed in a way that would not unchange. She lay in her alcove that night, unable to sleep. Not uncomfortably, just awake, listening to the cabin sounds and the creak and the particular nighttime quality of a valley in early June when everything is growing and the air is warm and the darkness feels full of something rather than empty of things. She was 30 years old. She had come to this place with $11 and no plan, and she had made something here, genuinely made something, with her hands and her mind and her stubborn refusal to let a difficult beginning define what came after. She was proud of it. She was allowed to be proud of it, and she was in love with Silas Boone, which she also needed to stop not saying, at least to herself, at least in the dark. She'd probably been in love with him since February, since the nutmeg, which was a ridiculous thing to be in love because of. A small jar of a spice, the fact that he drove to Sutter's store on a cold Friday specifically because she'd looked sad about something minor, but there it was. The heart kept its own accounting and didn't always check with the head first. The question was what to do about it. The answer she arrived at, after some time staring at the ceiling, was nothing rash. She was good at patient work. She could wait and watch and see whether the thing that had shifted between them on the evening she told him she'd refuse Chester would continue shifting on its own. She could be patient. She was considerably less patient than she'd planned to be. Not because she did anything, she didn't, but because the following Saturday something happened that changed the terms of what she was waiting on. It was a market day in Silver Hollow, the first big one of summer, when half the valley came in to trade and socialize and argue about prices, and generally conduct the business that had accumulated over the winter. Silas had brought them all in. The girls were nearly vibrating with excitement. It was the most people they'd been around since the Henderson gathering, and they'd been in the dry goods and the feed store and were standing at the edge of the market square where a man with a wagon had set up selling summer berries when Chester Pruitt appeared. He hadn't seen them yet. He was talking to two men near the well, laughing at something, his hat pushed back on his head in the way he wore it when he was feeling comfortable. Eliza saw him first and clocked him and felt her stomach do something complicated, and then went back to looking at the berries. Hazel saw him a moment later and went quiet in the specific way that meant she'd recognize something she didn't know how to categorize. Ruby,
who was less interested in categorizing things she didn't like and more interested in simply responding to them, moved closer to Eliza. Not dramatically, just repositioned. Silas had his back to the square and hadn't seen Chester yet. Eliza considered saying something and decided not to. The man was at the well and they were at the berries, and there was no particular reason anything needed to happen. The reason anything needed to happen was that Chester turned around. He saw Silas first, then he saw Eliza, and something passed across his face that she'd become familiar with, the recalculation, the small tightening around the mouth that was his version of frustration with the situation he couldn't control. Then his eyes moved to the girls, to the way Ruby was standing pressed against Eliza's side, to Hazel's hand which had found Eliza's without ceremony. And his expression did something she hadn't expected. It went almost sad. He walked over. There was nothing to do about it. He walked over and Silas turned when he heard his name, and the four of them were standing in a market square in Silver Hollow on a June Saturday in front of the berry wagon. "Silas," Chester said. He nodded, man to man, the nod that carried the specific history between them, which was not warm, but was not at war either. "Chester," Silas said. Chester looked at Eliza. "Miss Rowan." "Mr. Pruitt," she said. He looked at the girls, and Eliza felt Hazel's hand tighten slightly in hers. "You've got good color," Chester said to them, meaning it straightforwardly as a compliment. "You both look well." "Thank you," Hazel said, with the cautious politeness of a child who has learned to wait and see. Ruby said nothing, which was its own statement. Chester looked back at Silas. "Place looks good," he said. "Heard you're running more head this season." 12 more, Silas said. "Good." Chester nodded. There was a pause. He looked at Eliza again, not with the wanting something expression from the porch visit, but with something that might have been the result of 8 months of sitting with his own behavior. "I believe I owe you a public apology," he said, "seeing as how I made a public fool of myself on a public platform." She hadn't expected this. The porch apology had been private, calculated. This was neither. The people nearest them had gone quieter than berry shopping required. She was aware of it, so was he, clearly, because he was still standing there. "You don't have to," she started. "I talked to Margaret," he said. "She said she'd come to see you." He turned his hat in his hands, that gesture, again, but this time with something genuine in it. "I was wrong. What I said was cruel. I said it in front of people, and I can't unsay it. But I can say the rest of it in front of people too." He met her eyes. This is clearly, he stopped, tried again. "I was wrong about you. And I said it out loud where everyone could hear, so I'm saying this out loud where everyone can hear." The market square was quiet in the specific way that places get when a lot of people are pretending not to be listening. Eliza looked at him. She thought about the platform in October, about the word "that," about the cold suitcase handle in her hand and the 30 people who had seen her heartbreak in public, and not one of them moved except a quiet man near the wall with his hat in his hands and 2 small girls attached to his legs. "Thank you," she said. She meant it. It wasn't everything, but it was real. Chester nodded once. He looked at Silas, a look that contained things she wasn't part of, some conversation between men that would take place later, or not, but that needed acknowledging now. Silas looked back at him steadily and nodded, one of his single meaningful nods. Chester walked away. The market square's ambient noise returned to its normal level within about 10 seconds. Ruby looked up at Eliza. "That's the man from the platform," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Eliza said. "He said sorry," Hazel observed. "He did." "Did it help?" Eliza thought about it. "Yes," she said. "It did. Different than I thought it would, but yes." Ruby considered this. "Good," she decided and turned back to the berries. "Can we have some?" "The dark red ones." Silas bought them the dark red ones and also some of the yellow that turned out to be something close to honey when you bit into them. And they ate them, walking back to the wagon, and Ruby got juice on her dress and was briefly outraged about it, and then forgot to be outraged.
Hazel ate hers with the focused pleasure of a person giving food its proper attention. On the wagon home, with the girls in the back, Silas drove the first mile in silence and then said, without looking at her, "You handled that well." "I just stood there," she said. "You stood there without looking like you wanted to disappear," he said. "That's not nothing." She looked at the road ahead of them. The valley was gold and green in the June afternoon, and the mountains were close and the air was warm, and the horse moved at its steady pace. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Yes?" he said. She had not planned to say it today. She had planned patience, careful observation, waiting to see what shifted on its own. But they were alone on the wagon road with the girls half asleep in the back and the afternoon light doing what it did in June in this valley. And she had just watched a man apologize publicly for calling her unworthy, and she thought that maybe she was done waiting on things she already knew. "I think you should know," she said, keeping her eyes on the road, "that my reasons for staying here have become more—" She paused. "They've become more personal than they were when I arrived." Silas said nothing, but his hands on the reins were very still. "I'm not saying this to make anything difficult," she said. "I'm saying it because I found that I'm not able to keep not saying it without feeling dishonest, and I don't like feeling dishonest." "More personal," he said. His voice was carefully level. "Yes." "In what way?" he said. She turned and looked at him then, because the careful neutrality of his voice told her he knew exactly what way and was asking her to say it plainly, and she was the one who'd brought them here, so she owed him the plain version. "I care about you," she said, "more than is strictly practical for the arrangement. I'm aware that it may not be—" She stopped, started over. "You don't have to do anything with that. I'm not asking anything. I just couldn't go on knowing it and not saying it." The horse went at its pace. The road went through a stand of cottonwoods, and the light filtered through the new leaves and patches. Silas was quiet for long enough that she began to compose internally the speech she would give afterward about how everything could go on as before, and she wasn't going to make it strange. Then he said, "I built a room." She blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Off the back of the cabin." He was still looking at the road. "I've been working on it since March. It's not finished. I was going to—" He stopped. His jaw moved slightly. "I didn't know how to—" He stopped again. "You built a room," she said. "A proper bedroom," he said, "not an alcove with a curtain." He was quiet for a moment. "For you, if you wanted to stay. More permanently. I didn't know how to bring it up without it seeming like without making you feel obligated. You'd already turned down Chester, and I didn't want you to think I was asking—" He stopped, took a breath. "I didn't know how to say what I was asking." She looked at the side of his face. The weathered profile, the jaw set in the particular way of a man who has spent considerable energy not saying something and is now saying it and isn't sure of the ground under his feet. "Silas," she said. He looked at her. "You built me a room," she said. "It still needs the floor finished," he said, "and the window trim." "You built me a room," she said again, and she heard her own voice do something she hadn't expected, go a little rough at the edges. He looked back at the road. His hands on the reins relaxed, fractionally. "I've been thinking about asking you," he said carefully, "to consider whether what we have here might be—whether you might want it to be." He tried again. "I'm not easy," he said. "I know that. I don't talk enough, and I'm gone most of the day, and I still have—Clara is still—there are still things I'm working through. I'm not—" "Silas," she said. He stopped. "I know who you are," she said. "I've lived in your house for 8 months. I know you don't talk enough, and I know you're gone before light, and I know that you're still working through some things." She paused. "I'm not asking for someone who has it all figured out. I've got my own. I have things I'm working through too." She looked at the road. "I'm asking if you want to try." He was quiet for a long moment. From the back of the wagon, Ruby said sleepily, "Are you two talking about something important?" "Yes," Silas said. "Okay," Ruby said, and went back to whatever half-sleep she'd been in.
Hazel, who had apparently been awake the whole time, said nothing, but Eliza felt her sit up slightly in the back, felt the shift in weight that meant she was paying attention. "Yes," Silas said after a moment. "Not to Ruby, or not only to Ruby." Eliza looked at him. "Yes," he said again, directly to her this time, with the full weight of the word, the way Silas Boone said the things that mattered, once, plainly, without decoration. She turned back to the road. She was not going to cry. She was a practical woman with good control of herself, and she was on a wagon bench in full daylight, and she was absolutely not going to cry. Her eyes stung. She ignored them. "The floor can wait," she said. "I'll help with the window trim." He made a sound that was, and she would think about this later, would replay it, the closest thing to a laugh she had ever heard from him, short and low and entirely genuine.
They drove the rest of the way home without talking much, but it was the warmest quiet they'd ever shared, and she was aware of his arm near hers on the bench, not quite touching, and neither of them moved away. When they got back to the cabin and the girls jumped down and ran for the porch, Silas tied the horse and came around to her side and offered his hand for the step down, the way he'd started doing at the Henderson gathering months ago. She took it, and this time, when she was on the ground, he didn't let go immediately. He held her hand for a moment, just a moment, nothing dramatic, the most modest and tentative of gestures, and she looked up at him and he looked down at her with that steady dark gaze that had always made her feel looked at rather than assessed. Then he let go and went to see to the horse. She stood beside the wagon for a moment with the summer afternoon around her and the sound of the girls already inside and the smell of the garden and the distant creek. She stood there feeling, without any preparation for it, completely whole. Not fixed. She wasn't fixed. There were still rough edges and things she was working through and a life that didn't look like anything she'd originally planned. But whole. Present in herself. In this place. In this life she had built from what had looked like nothing. She went inside. Hazel was at the table with her drawing book, already working on something. She looked up when Eliza came in, and she had the expression she sometimes had, the old soul expression, the one that was too knowing for 7 years old. "Is everything decided?" Hazel asked. Eliza hung her coat on the hook next to Silas's. "Getting there," she said. Hazel nodded and looked back down at her drawing. "Good," she said. "I drew the room Papa built. Do you want to see?" Eliza stopped. "He told you about the room?" "He didn't tell us," Hazel said. "We saw him working on it, in March." She said this as if it should have been obvious. "Ruby thought it was a storage room. I knew it wasn't a storage room." "How did you know?" Eliza asked. Hazel held up the drawing. It was the back of the cabin, rendered in pencil with the particular confident inaccuracy of a 7-year-old who cared more about feeling than precision. And there was the new room, and there was a window with curtains in it, and in front of the window was a figure with hair that was probably meant to be Eliza's. "Because he put a window in it," Hazel said. "Papa doesn't put windows in storage rooms." Eliza looked at the drawing for a moment. "That's very logical," she said. "I know," Hazel said. Ruby came in from outside and stopped when she saw Eliza's expression. "What did I miss?" Ruby demanded. "Nothing yet," Eliza said. "Wash your hands. I'll start supper." "You always say nothing yet when it's something," Ruby said. "Ruby," Eliza said. "Fine," Ruby said, and went to the basin. Eliza tied her apron and went to the stove and stood there for a moment before she started. Just stood there in the kitchen with the herbs drying in the window and the girls' voices behind her and the sound of Silas outside with the horse. And she thought about a train platform in October and a worn suitcase and a letter she'd read so many times the creases had gone soft. She thought about a man who hadn't let her finish stepping off the train, and a word, that, and the particular sound of 30 people pretending not to notice. She thought about a quiet man near the wall with his hat in his hands. She thought about ribbon, blue and yellow, serious in different ways. She thought about nutmeg in February and a dancing Burl Hadley who was sincere about bread and an April morning when she'd realized she was home. She thought about what it cost to let yourself want something after being told, publicly, that you weren't worth wanting. She thought about it all, briefly, in the kitchen with the summer light coming through the window. And then she reached for the pot and started supper, because that was the kind of woman she was, and this was the kind of life she'd made.
and she would not trade it for anything Chester Pruitt had ever had or ever would have. Outside, she could hear Silas talking to the horse in the low voice he used when he didn't think anyone could hear him. She couldn't make out the words. It didn't matter. She already knew what she needed to know. The window trim took them 3 evenings to finish. Silas had the wood cut and shaped already. He'd done that part in March when he'd done the rest of it, apparently. During those long evenings, she'd thought he was repairing tack in the shed, and what remained was fitting it, sanding it, painting it the same white as the other windows in the cabin. He did the fitting. She did the sanding. The girls supervised with the solemn enthusiasm of a construction committee that had strong opinions but limited technical knowledge. "It should be a different color," Ruby said on the second evening. "White is what everything already is." "White is consistent," Hazel said. "Consistent is boring." "Consistent is reliable," Hazel said. "That's different from boring." "The window is going to be white," Silas said, in the tone he used when a decision had been made and the committee's input period was closed. Ruby accepted this with the expression of someone who was recording the decision under protest. On the third evening, when the trim was painted and dry and the room was finished in the practical sense, floor done, window in, a hook on the back of the door where she could hang things, Silas showed it to her properly. He opened the door and stood back and let her go in first, which was a small thing and not a small thing. The room was narrow but real. It had a proper door that latched. It had a window that faced east, which meant morning light, which she hadn't had in the alcove. The floor was plain wood, not beautiful, but level and solid and swept clean. There was nothing in it yet except a narrow iron-framed bed that he'd moved from the storage shed and a small table beside it. She stood in the middle of it and looked at the window and at the light coming through it in the early evening. And she thought about the curtained alcove she'd slept in for 8 months, and the narrow cot that she'd made her peace with, and the way she'd sometimes lain awake listening through the wall to the sounds of the cabin. "It's good," she said. She meant it without qualification. He was standing in the doorway. "The table's not much. I can make a better one when I have time." "The table is fine," she said. "I was going to put a shelf on that wall." "Silas," she said. He stopped. "It's good," she said again, and looked at him, and he understood that she meant more than the room, and he nodded in that way he had, once complete. She moved into the room that weekend. It took about 20 minutes because she didn't have much, which was something she'd grown accustomed to and no longer minded. Her suitcase, her mother's Bible with the pressed flowers, her sewing kit, the 3 dresses she'd accumulated since October, the 2 she'd arrived with and one that Dora Whitfield had given her in winter, saying it had been too small for her for years and would Eliza take it, which was a kindness dressed up as practicality. The letter from Pauline in Ohio, now worn at the folds from being read and reread. She arranged these things in the new room and put her wildflower Bible on the small table and hung her spare dress on the hook behind the door, and that was it. That was what she owned in the world. And standing in that small eastern room with the morning light coming through the window Silas had built for her, she felt richer than she had any rational cause to feel. The question of what they were to each other, the formal question, the one the Valley would have opinions about, resolved itself in late July in a way that was both more and less dramatic than she'd anticipated. It resolved on a Sunday afternoon, which was the one afternoon in the week when Silas didn't work if he could help it, not out of any particular conviction, but out of the simple physical necessity of a body that needed one afternoon. He was on the porch with his coffee, and she was inside finishing a hem she'd been working on, and the girls were at the creek. They were allowed to go alone now, with the clear understanding that no one was to cross it or do anything that required explaining later, and the cabin was quiet in the particular full way of a Sunday afternoon in July. She heard him stand up on the porch. She heard his boots, one step, and then the screen door, and then he was in the doorway of the main room. She looked up from her hem. He was holding his coffee cup in both hands and looking at her with the expression she had learned to recognize as the expression that preceded something he'd been working toward for a while. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. She set the hem down. He came in and sat across from her at the table and set his cup down and looked at it for a moment. "I'm not good at the formal kind of thing," he said. "I want to be upfront about that." "I know," she said. "I've met you." The almost smile.
I've been thinking about... He stopped, looked at the table, looked at her. I want you to be my wife, he said. Not the arrangement, not what we've been. I want to... He stopped again. I want it to be real. The room was quiet. She had known this was coming in some form since the wagon road in June. She had known it, and she had let herself know it, and she had still not prepared a response, because some things you couldn't prepare, and this was one of them. It is real, she said. It's been real. You know what I mean, he said. I do, she said. She looked at him, the weathered face, the hands around the coffee cup, the man who had built her a room with an east window in secret over the course of a Wyoming winter, because he didn't know how to ask for what he wanted, but he knew how to build it. Yes, she said. I want that too. He let out a breath. It was a small sound, but she felt the size of what it had been carrying. I'm still... he started. Silas, she said, we're going to have plenty of time to be imperfect together. We don't have to account for all of it today. He looked at her with something that was past the almost smile. Something she'd been waiting to see on his face and hadn't had a word for, and now thought the word might simply be happy, unguarded and unglamorous and completely real. No, he said. I suppose we don't. They were married in September, which was a year almost to the month from the day she had stepped off the train at Silver Hollow Station with her suitcase and her $11 and a letter that had promised her character would be enough. It was a small wedding in the literal sense, just the Valley people, Dora Whitfield, the Hendersons, Helen Price, and her husband, Burl Hadley, who cleaned up considerably better than Eliza had expected and cried openly at 2 different points, which he did not appear to feel any embarrassment about. The ceremony was brief, conducted by a justice of the peace named Aldous Fenn, who was 80 years old and had married so many people in Silver Hollow Valley that he moved through the words with the comfortable authority of someone returning to a place they know well. The girls wore blue and yellow ribbon respectively, which had been a negotiation of some weeks. They stood on either side of Eliza and Silas during the ceremony with the gravity of people who understood the occasion's weight. And when Aldous Fenn said the final words and it was done, Ruby turned to Hazel and said, quietly, but not quietly enough, I told you yellow was right for important things. Blue is also right for important things, Hazel said. You're both right, Eliza said. See, Ruby said to Hazel. She said we're both right, Hazel said. Children, Silas said. They both subsided. But Ruby was smiling, and Hazel had her ancient soul look, and Eliza thought she would keep the whole of this afternoon in the exact form it was occurring in, imperfect and alive and entirely hers. Afterward, there was food at the Henderson place, which was large enough to hold the valley. Burl Hadley asked her to dance again, which she did, and this time she was better at it because she'd had a year to practice moving in her own skin without bracing for impact. Silas danced exactly once with her, and he was a capable dancer, which surprised her, and she told him so, and he said he'd learned as a young man, and she said she wouldn't have guessed, and he said most things about him were not easily guessed, which was the closest thing to a self-aware joke she'd ever heard from him, and she laughed, and he looked pleased about having made her laugh, and that was better than any ceremony. Dora Whitfield found her near the end of the evening, near the edge of the light, and stood beside her watching the room. I want to say something, Dora said. You'll say it whether I want you to or not, Eliza said, which was affectionate and true. Dora smiled. When you came off that train, she said, and Chester Pruitt said what he said, I saw it happen. I was on the platform. I had my own things I was thinking about you. I won't pretend otherwise. But I watched you pick up that suitcase, and I thought... She paused. I thought, there's a woman who knows how to carry something. Eliza looked at the room, at Silas talking to Henderson near the fire, at the girls sitting with the Henderson children at the long table in a comfortable heap of tangled small humanity. I've had practice, she said. You have, Dora said. That's my point. It wasn't luck that put you where you are, Eliza. It was you. I want you to know someone said it plainly. She didn't have a response to this that felt adequate, so she simply squeezed Dora's hand and they stood together watching the room, and it was enough. Chester Pruitt was not at the wedding, which was appropriate and also his own doing. He had sent, through a neutral party, a note that said he hoped them well, which Silas had read and set on the mantel without comment, and Eliza had read and set aside, and neither of them had found it necessary to discuss further. He had done the right thing publicly at the market in June, and he had sent a civil note in September, and that was, she thought, about the best accounting you could ask from a man who was constitutionally limited in the self-examination department. She wished him no particular harm. She just didn't think about him much. What she thought about, in the weeks and months after the wedding, was the texture of the life she was living, not the large outlines of it. Those were obvious enough, visible from outside, but the grain of it, the specific daily substance. The way October came back around and she stood on the platform at Silver Hollow Station, helping Dora receive a cousin arriving from Cheyenne. And she stood on that platform in her good coat and looked at the train coming in and remembered herself coming off a train on a platform just like this one exactly a year before. And the memory had the quality of something that had happened to a slightly different person. Not a person she didn't recognize, but a person carrying more fear than she was carrying now. The way Ruby had taken to reading with an appetite that exceeded the cabin's small supply of books. And they'd written to a bookseller in Denver who sent a crate in November, and Ruby had gone through it by February with a focused speed that alarmed Silas slightly and delighted Eliza completely, and they'd written for another crate in March. The way Hazel had gotten her horse. This had been a whole season in the making, and Eliza had been the one to bring it over the finish line, which she would have done sooner if she'd understood how seriously Hazel meant it and how feasible it actually was. In the end, it was not a dramatic event. Burl Hadley had a young mare he couldn't keep through another winter, and he sold her to Silas at a fair price in November, and they brought her home on a cold, clear Saturday. And Hazel stood in the barn doorway looking at this horse with an expression that Eliza would carry for the rest of her life. Not screaming joy, not the performed delight of a child receiving something they'd asked for. Just stillness. Complete and total stillness, the way Hazel went when something mattered more than words. "Her name is going to be Blue," Hazel said after a long moment. "Blue is a good name," Eliza said. "It's calm," Hazel said. "Calm is serious." "I know," Eliza said. Silas, standing behind them both, said nothing, but she could feel him beside her, the warmth of him in the cold barn, and she knew by the quality of his silence that he was happy, specifically and genuinely happy, in the way that a man who has been lonely for a long time learns to be surprised by happiness when it shows up. She reached over, without looking at him, and found his hand. He took it. They stood there watching their daughter look at her horse. Their daughter. She had started to think it that way somewhere around February of the first year, and had noticed herself doing it and hadn't tried to correct it, because correcting it would have been dishonest, and she'd made a policy of not being dishonest with herself even when the truth was complicated. It was complicated. Hazel and Ruby had a mother, had had a mother, and Clara was real and not replaceable and never asked to be replaced. Eliza had understood this from the beginning, and she understood it more deeply now, in the second year, because she'd seen the shapes of Clara's absence in more detail, had seen the specific moments when one or both girls went somewhere private with their grief, when the herbs in the window or a certain smell of cold air brought something to their faces that she recognized and stood apart from, because that particular thing was theirs and not hers to fix. What she had come to understand, slowly and without any dramatic revelation, was that she didn't need to be Clara, and she didn't need to fill Clara's absence. She needed to be present in her own right, and to love these girls as the specific people they were, and to trust that there was room for more than one kind of love in a life and a family, and that adding something didn't subtract from what had already existed. She wasn't sure she had always gotten this right. There were moments. An evening in the second winter when Ruby had been quiet for a week, and Eliza had pushed too hard to know what was wrong, and Ruby had said, with a 7-year-old's devastating accuracy, "Sometimes I don't want to tell you, I want to tell Mama," and Eliza had said okay, and had gone to her creek and sat on her rock in the cold and let herself feel the weight of what that was, and then had gone back inside and made hot cocoa and not mentioned it again. She thought that had been the right call. She thought she'd been right about the not pushing. She'd been less sure, sitting on that rock, about whether she'd handled the feeling correctly, whether she was supposed to feel what she'd felt, or whether it made her selfish. She mentioned it to Silas that night, because they had developed the habit of talking to each other honestly about the things they were getting wrong, which was one of the better parts of being married to a man who didn't use more words than were necessary. He never talked over you when you said something difficult, just received it and thought about it and said what he actually thought. "She needed to say that," he said. "I know," Eliza said. "And she said it to you," he said. "Not to me, not to Dora, to you." She looked at him. "That means you're the person she trusts to hear it," he said. "Even the hard part, even the part that—" He paused. "The part that might hurt you." She thought about this. "That's an optimistic interpretation," she said. "It's the accurate one," he said. She wasn't entirely sure he was right, but she thought he might be, and she let herself believe it because sometimes the most useful thing you can do with a hard truth is to hold it next to a generous one and see which one does more good. By the second spring, the ranch had changed in ways that were visible from the road. The garden was twice the size of what she'd started with, formal enough now that she'd put in beds rather than rows, with a low fence to keep the rabbits out that Hazel had helped build with a seriousness of purpose that suggested she had opinions about fencing that she'd been waiting to express. The barn had new boards on the south face where the old ones had rotted. The porch had a swing that Silas had built in the deep of winter and installed on the first warm day of March, and on evenings when the weather permitted, all four of them sat on it with varying degrees of proximity and engagement. Silas at one end, Eliza at the other, the girls in the middle, or draped over the railing, or gone and come back and gone again, in the way of children who are not quite ready for the evening to end, but can't commit to sitting still. People from the valley came to the ranch differently now than they had in the first year. Not with the covered dish curiosity of that first autumn, but with the easy familiarity of people coming to a place they'd decided was part of their landscape. Helen Price stopped by on her way to and from the south end of the valley, and drank coffee at the kitchen table, and didn't look around cataloging things. Burl Hadley came to see Blue as often as he came to see the people, and Hazel was exacting about which visitors she allowed near the horse and which she felt needed to earn it, and Burl had earned it by bringing carrots every third visit without being asked. Dora Whitfield remained the most consistent visitor and the most honest one. She had the virtue of saying what she thought and being wrong at the right frequency, often enough to be interesting, rarely enough to be trusted, and Eliza had come to value her the way you value someone who shows up and tells you the truth even when it's inconvenient. It was Dora who told her, on a morning in the 2nd April, that Chester Pruitt had sold his ranch. "He's going to Colorado," Dora said, wrapping both hands around her coffee. "Some business opportunity. That's what Margaret says." Eliza looked at her coffee. "He's not a bad man," she said after a moment. "He's just limited in what he can see." "That's generous," Dora said. "It's accurate," Eliza said. "There's a difference." She had thought about Chester more than she'd expected to in the 2 years since the platform. Not with anger. The anger had been real, and she'd let it be real, and it had metabolized eventually into something flatter and less energetic. What she'd thought about was the specific nature of his mistake, because she thought it was instructive, and she was the kind of person who found instruction useful even in painful things. Chester Pruitt had looked at a woman standing on a platform with a worn suitcase and seen the surface of her, the travel-tired face, the unremarkable dress, the gap between what he'd imagined and what had arrived, and had made a complete assessment based on that surface, quickly, publicly, and with total confidence. He had not been curious. That was the thing. He had not thought, "Let me find out who this person is." He had thought, "I can see what this is, and I don't want it." And the tragedy of it, if you could call it that, if a man's own incuriosity constituted a tragedy, was that he'd been standing on a platform next to the most consequential decision of her life, and he'd sent it away without a second look. She didn't think about this with vindication. She'd felt vindication in the early months, and she'd let herself feel it because she was human, and it was earned. But what replaced it, when the vindication settled, was something quieter and more permanent, a kind of knowledge about what it costs to see people only on their surfaces. Chester had paid a price for his incuriosity that she genuinely hadn't wanted him to pay, because the price of his mistake hadn't fallen only on him. It had fallen first and hardest on her, on that cold platform, in front of 30 people. What she wanted, she had decided, was not for him to suffer.
What she wanted was for the lesson to have cost him enough that it stuck. She didn't know if it had. She thought about that sometimes and concluded she would never know and could stop wondering about it. "Good luck to him in Colorado," she said to Dora. Dora looked at her with the expression she sometimes had, the one that meant she was revising something upward. "You're a better person than I am," Dora said. "I'm a practical person," Eliza said. "It takes too much energy to hold on to things that are finished." This was true. It was also, she knew, something she'd had to learn, because she had not always been practical about the things she held on to. She had held on to her first image of the life she'd been going to have, the letters, the man who said character was enough, the respectable and quiet future she'd constructed in her mind on the train west, and she'd held it long enough to grieve it properly, and then she'd put it down. Putting things down was a skill. She thought more people should know that it was a skill, that it didn't happen naturally, that you had to practice it the way you practiced anything worth doing. The night before the second anniversary of her arrival at Silver Hollow, Eliza sat at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed, and Silas had gone to check on the barn, and she looked at the room around her, at the herbs in the window and the girls' drawings on the wall. Better now, more confident. Hazel had moved past horses into elaborate landscapes, and Ruby had started drawing people, specific people, rendered with a documentary accuracy that was occasionally uncomfortable. There was a drawing of Eliza on the wall that Ruby had done in March, that Silas had tacked up without asking, and Eliza had looked at it when she first noticed it and thought, "Is that how she sees me?" The figure in the drawing was not beautiful by any conventional measure. Ruby wasn't flattering, she was accurate, but she was upright and solid and specific, a person in a particular place with a particular face, and there was something in the posture that suggested a woman who knew where she was standing. She looked at that drawing and she thought about the word "that." She thought about how much work the word "that" had done, the damage it had done, the way it had moved through her like a cold current, and she thought about all the things that had been built in its wake. Not because of it, not in spite of it exactly, just after. In the time and place that came after, which was the only time and place available once a thing had happened. She heard Silas on the porch, the familiar weight of him on the boards, heard him knock his boots against the step the way he did. Heard the screen door. He came in and looked at her at the table and said, "Everything all right?" "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" He went to pour the last of the coffee. "About arriving here," she said. "It's been almost 2 years." He came and sat across from her with his coffee and looked at her steadily. 2 years, he said. "The 19th of October, she said. "Tomorrow." He looked at his cup for a moment. "Do you want to? Is there something you want to do? To mark it?" She thought about it. "No," she said. I wanted to say it, to have said it to someone who was there." He raised his eyes to her. "I was there," he said. "I know," she said. They sat with this. Outside, the October wind was starting its work along the ridge, the sound she'd learned in her first winter and made her peace with in her second. Inside, the fire had burned to good steady coals, and the kitchen was warm, and somewhere in the back of the cabin the girls were asleep, Ruby probably with a book on her face, and Hazel probably with her hand curved as though she'd been drawing in her sleep. "I want to ask you something," Eliza said. He waited, the way he always waited, complete attention, no impatience. "Are you happy?" she asked. I don't mean in a grand sense, I mean," she paused. "Here, this. Are you?" He didn't answer right away, which she didn't take as hesitation, but as the seriousness he gave to questions that deserved it. "Yes," he said. Then, because he was who he was, and sometimes said more than expected, "I was afraid for a long time that I wouldn't be, that this was—" He stopped. "After Clara. I thought the warm parts were done. I thought that was something that happened to you once, and then you just kept going." He looked at the fire. "I didn't know how to want something again. It felt like I didn't think I was supposed to." She looked at his face in the firelight. "And now?" she said. He looked at her.
And now I have an east window in the back room and 2 daughters who argue about the philosophical significance of colors, and a wife who can split wood and make bread that Burl Hadley cries about, he said. Yes, I'm happy. She felt that settle through her, the way warmth does. Not sudden, but thorough, reaching the parts that were last to warm up. I'm happy too, she said. And then because she was honest and honesty required the whole account. It's not what I planned. None of it is what I planned. I know, he said. I planned something very ordinary, she said. A man who wrote that character was enough. A house somewhere. A quiet kind of life. Is this not quiet? He said. She laughed. Actually laughed, the full version. And he sat across from her looking pleased about it. And the fire did what fires do, and outside the October wind kept working. It's exactly quiet enough, she said. She thought, later, lying in her room with the east window dark and the stars visible through it. If she turned her head, she thought that the story of how she'd gotten here was the kind of story that looked one way from outside and another from inside. From outside, it was a story about a woman who was rejected and then found something better. That was the version that traveled, that got simplified into the thing people said at the market or over covered dishes at someone's kitchen table. From inside, it was more specific than that. It was about a Tuesday morning on a train platform when a man who had decided what she was worth said so out loud, and it was about the particular quality of shame that lives in your body, not your mind, and it was about picking up a suitcase because there was nothing else to do. It was about a quiet man who had seen her stand there and had thought not. What a shame. But there's a person who knows how to carry a hard thing. It was about ribbon, blue and yellow, about nutmeg in February, about a child who cried at night, and a woman who got up in the dark because getting up was the thing to do. About a room with an east window, built in secret over a Wyoming winter, by a man who didn't know how to ask for what he wanted, but knew how to build toward it. It was a story about what you made of the life that came after the life you'd planned. She had come to believe, in the 2 years of making it, that the life that came after was often the one that fit. Not because suffering produced wisdom, she didn't think it necessarily did. She'd known plenty of people who suffered without becoming wiser or kinder or more alive. But because the life you planned was built from what you knew about yourself before you'd been tested. And testing changed the specifications. Testing showed you what you were actually made of, what you actually needed, what kind of soil you actually grew in. She had grown, it turned out, in this soil. In a Wyoming valley, with an October wind and a creek behind the cabin, and a man who said everything that mattered in as few words as possible, and 2 girls who were going to be extraordinary people and who were, right now, asleep in the back room arguing about colors in their dreams. She closed her eyes. The house settled around her, making its small sounds. The fire in the other room, the wind, the horse in the barn, blue, calm, and serious. Hazel's horse. The creak of the porch swing that hadn't been tied up and was moving slightly in the wind, and would need to be tied up, which she would mention to Silas in the morning. She would mention the swing. She would make bread. She would help Ruby with the long division that was giving her trouble this week. She would go to her creek, unfrozen still, just barely, it would be iced over soon, and sit on her rock for 15 minutes before anyone else woke up. She would do all of this, and it would be ordinary in the way that only the things you fought for get to be ordinary. The particular ordinariness of a life that is yours, that you made, that nobody handed you and nobody can take back. She lay in her room with the stars in her east window, and she let herself have it, the whole of it, the hard parts and the warm parts, and the parts she was still working on, and she thought, this is what it feels like to belong somewhere, not to arrive, not to be accepted or approved of or found adequate by someone who'd decided they were qualified to judge. To belong. To have put your hands in the soil of a place and worked it and stayed through the winter and come back in spring and done it again until the place knew your weight the way the sitting rock by the creek knew it, until you were written into it and it into you. That was what she had. That was what she was. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had not known, On a train platform in October with a worn suitcase and $11 and a heart cracking open like dry soil that she was riding toward.